Will you pray for me? Lord, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, because you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. France, in the 10th century, was a wreck. The central authority had dissolved. There was no one running much of anything, so there were dozens and dozens of little fiefdoms, little feudal kingdoms, each with their own petty lords, always at war. They were always grasping for just a little more territory, just a little more power, just one more castle. And of course, a lot of soldiers died in those days, but actually, a lot of everybody died. Isaiah says that the people wither like grass and fade away. Well, it was never truer than in France in the 10th century. There were no rules about who you could kill and couldn't kill, whom you could attack and whom you shouldn't attack. In fact, it was probably a good idea, if you were a soldier attacking another country, for you to kill everyone you could, because the more peasants you killed, the more animals you slaughtered, the more fields you ruined, the more you reduced your enemy's power. So no one was safe, not women, not children, not the poor, not non-combatants of any kind, not the mules and the very pigs in the sties. And blood ran across the land like a tidal wave. You could be a peasant there, just doing your work, and here comes a soldier, and you could hold your hands up like this, and they would kill you anyway. You could be a little kid on a swing with a toy sword, and they could kill you with impunity. They could jump on you and put you in a chokehold, and even if you yelled, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe," they could kill you and no one would do a thing. Until one day, the Christians decided to do something. Everyone was nominally Christian in that part of the world, but they decided they had had enough. The ones who listened to Isaiah, the ones who longed for God, the ones who had met Jesus in the people around them, they said, "This is enough." And so they called a great council, and the bishops came together and they created what they called the peace of God. Eventually the Pope would ratify it. Eventually it would spread all the way across Europe. But here's what it meant. No non-combatant was allowed to be killed by a soldier. The children, the women, the clergy, the poor, the animals in the yards, all were protected by the peace of God. And if you were to break the peace of God and kill one of these people, you would be excommunicated, which was a bigger deal then than it is now. It didn't work perfectly. These things never do. If you were to kill a peasant, if you were a soldier and you were to kill a peasant, if you had enough money, you could buy your way back in. But it did work. No one had ever heard anything like this before. Never in recorded history had anyone decided to protect entire classes of people from the ones with weapons. About 150 years later, they extended it still further. Originally, it was just those classes of people that couldn't be caught up in the fighting that were protected. But about 150 years later, they created something called the truce of God. First, there was the peace of God. Then they created the truce of God. And that meant that there were certain days that nobody was allowed to fight at all under any circumstances. Sunday was one. The season of Advent was one. The season of Lent was one. From Easter until 8 days after Pentecost was one. By the 12th century, they had expanded the truce of God so fully that there were only 80 days out of every 365 that you were allowed to fight a war. It's better than nothing, is it not? And consider this. This was the first truce in known history. People had stopped fighting before, but it was always to pull your army back, to regroup, to get ready to attack again. Or maybe you would ride out, you've seen this in a movie, ride out under a white flag for a parley, and representatives from the different sides would talk, but no one had ever even heard of a truce before this moment. And you know those bishops and those clergymen did everything they could to add one more day to the list of days on which you could not fight, because they could see what war did to the land. And they were having none of it because they knew God loved the land and the people. Side note, sooner or later, after you go out of this place, somebody's going to come up to you and talk to you about how violent Christians have been all through the years. And that person will probably be right, but I hope next time somebody says that to you, you will be able to say, well, at least we invented the truce. Beat that. This wasn't perfect either, but it was better than nothing. Here's the thing about the peace of God, that first movement that they did. The clergy made it happen. The bishops wrote the laws. The Pope ratified it. But it was the people that gave the energy for it. When they got word that the clergy were considering this, considering protecting them, considering raising them up to the level of human being with a little dignity that should be protected by the authorities and the law, they could see Isaiah's vision coming true. Those high mountains with the kings and the soldiers and the swords up on top of them, and there they were in those valleys with almost nothing. They could see Isaiah's vision happening where they would be on a level plane, a level playing field, all human in God's sight. They could see it happening, and so the people rose up. It was the first non-violent mass gathering in European history, as far as we know. The people rose up, they gathered, they were peaceful, and they said, yes, make this happen. They marched across the land and they said, yes, we are human, do it. All across France, they trod across those blood-soaked fields and demanded that the authorities, that the law, that the potentates and principalities see them the way God sees them. And I can't help but think, this last week especially, I can't help but think that they could see into the future, that they knew what would happen if they didn't rise up and walk the streets and the fields, that they could look halfway around the world to Ferguson, to Cleveland, to New York City, where the people would rise up and demand that everyone be recognized as human, that everyone be protected, that the peace of God be extended to teenagers and kids on swings and men on the ground in chokeholds. Don't you think they could see that coming? Don't you think they would want us to remember what they did so we should know what we ought to do? Don't you think they believed in a God who was going to come and protect them? And didn't that very thing come to pass? Say amen.